Okay, welcome to the final lecture of Module 3. So we're wrapping up AP Unit 2, which is Interactions Among Branches of Government. In this section, we're going to focus on the bureaucracy, which is not a independent branch of government. It's part of the executive branch, but still has a lot of really important functions and things to consider, enough so that we can devote an entire lecture to it. So let's get into it. Objective 1, explain how this bureaucracy carries out the responsibilities of the federal government. Okay, so what exactly does the bureaucracy do? We'll start with different tasks performed by the departments, agencies, commissions, and government, corporations, represented by such things as, so this is a list of things that the bureaucracy and the different groups that are part of the bureaucracy actually do. They write and enforce regulations. They issue fines. They testify before Congress, and they are part of these groups called issue networks or iron triangles. At the bottom, I kind of have a summary of what exactly at its core the bureaucracy does. Mentioned earlier that it's part of the executive branch technically, but it's really the part of the government that actually does the public policy. It implements the public policy and provide services to the public. So they're the ones that are cutting checks for people to get their Social Security benefits, or providing services to veterans, or providing for the upkeep of the military and the Department of Defense, that sort of thing. One other note as far as testifying for Congress, we'll get to a little bit of this later on in this section, but Congress exercises oversight of the bureaucracy by requiring regular updates on the activities and performance of the various agencies of the bureaucracy by having them testify before Congress. Iron triangles are these, just to review what that is, are these little groups within government. Talked about these in one of the earlier modules, one of the earlier AP units we reviewed, but an iron triangle is responsible for a lot of the minute policy decisions that get made around a particular area of policy, and it includes 3 different parts. So it includes a bureaucratic agency, as we're talking about in this section. It includes an interest group that's involved in that policy area, and it involves any relevant congressional committees or subcommittees that deal with studying and developing policy on that particular area of policy. Okay, patronage versus civil service. One of the important things to understand about the bureaucracy is who works for the bureaucracy and how do those people get there. Political patronage, civil service, merit system reforms all impact the effectiveness of the bureaucracy by promoting professionalism, specialization, and neutrality. Let's take a trip back in history. Up until the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which was passed in the 1880s. Up until that time, almost all of the people that worked for the federal bureaucracy were essentially political appointees. They were picked by the president and his administration, so they were directly accountable and felt the pressure brought to bear by a presidential administration. In the 1880s, that changed with the passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which really transformed the bureaucracy by making the vast majority, well north of 95, 98% of the people that work within the bureaucracy, civil servants that are independently hired and fired based on merit, not on knowing people and being appointed by political allies, but based on your qualifications for the position. So that means that starting with the Pendleton Act and from that point forward, only the very, very top ranking officials within the different bureaucratic organizations are still political appointees picked by the president. One of the important implications of this is that it means that presidents have a fairly limited direct authority over the vast majority of employees that work within the executive branch in the bureaucracy. And that can sometimes hinder a president's ability to shape the way the policy is implemented. The president might like to have something done a certain way within the bureaucracy, but because probably 98, 99% of the people that actually put those policies into effect on a day-to-day basis are not directly accountable to him, because they're independently hired and fired. That means he doesn't necessarily have as much direct influence over those people. Objective 2, explain how the federal bureaucracy uses delegated discretionary authority for rulemaking and implementations. Okay, so discretionary and rulemaking authority to implement policy are given to bureaucratic departments, agencies, and commissions such as, and here we have a list of different bureaucratic organizations. So put an important note over here on the right to kind of explain what we're talking about here. So as far as as part of the implementation process, what we mean by that is that bureaucratic agencies take the broad policy goals that are expressed in legislation, that is, laws that are passed by Congress, and they develop specific rules and regulations in terms of putting those into effect, and they exercise some discretion on how those rules and regulations are enforced. So we do have a list of specific bureaucratic organizations here, and I created a little table on the next screen that kind of gives a brief overview of what each of these organizations does. And I'm doing this because I figure that if these things are specifically mentioned in the AP syllabus, you could technically be held responsible, or they could ask you or reference one of these organizations in a question they might ask. So just a little bit of very, very basic information. Department of Homeland Security, of course, is designed to improve the security of the United States, works on things like customs enforcement, borders, immigration enforcement, as well as emergency response to natural disasters and man-made disasters. They do anti-terrorism stuff, cybersecurity, those types of things. Name, kind of self-explanatory. Department of Transportation, also pretty self-explanatory. Department of Veterans Affairs oversees any kind of benefits that are provided as far as health care and pensions and things like that. Various services that are provided to our veterans. Department of Education, again, fairly self-explanatory. Those four are all cabinet-level departments. They have someone at the head of the organization called a secretary of whatever, Homeland Security, Transportation, whatnot. There are 15 of those in the government. And then we have other types of organizations. We have the Environmental Protection Agency, which is not technically a department, but is a cabinet-level agency. So it's kind of on the same standing as one of the cabinet departments, but is technically not one. But the Department of Environmental Protection, the Environmental Protection Agency is responsible for protecting people in the environment from health risks, and conducts research and develops environmental regulations and enforces them. Federal Election Commission, we talked a little bit in my course about the FEC as far as its role in regulating campaign finance laws and enforcing campaign finance laws, and any kind of rules and regulations they would be responsible as far as elections for enforcing and developing. And then the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, is basically in charge of the stock market, regulating the stock market, regulating stock brokers, things like that, investment advisors, mutual funds, to make sure that it's fair for everyone who's participating in that arena. Objective 3, explain how Congress uses its oversight power in its relationship with the executive branch. Congressional oversight of the bureaucracy. Oversight, we mentioned earlier, is one of the checks and balances that Congress has against the bureaucracy. But these are methods used by Congress to ensure the legislation that they have passed and they've written and passed is actually implemented as designed. And so some of the things that they can do to that end are committee hearings. So when a particular committee within the House or the Senate is responsible for helping to develop and ultimately pass a piece of legislation, their job doesn't end there once a bill is passed. They continue to be responsible for monitoring how the bureaucracy is implementing that particular area of policy in the future. So they're going to hold hearings and call people in from the bureaucracy to monitor how exactly those things are being enforced. And then power of the purse. This refers to the Congress's budgetary authority. They provide funding for all other parts of the government, including the bureaucracy. that is maybe one of, if not the most powerful tool that Congress has available to it in many circumstances, because everything relies on funding. So ultimately, if Congress is unhappy with the way that something is being implemented by the bureaucracy, they can cut funding if they would like. As a means to curtail the use of presidential power, congressional oversight serves as a check on executive authorization and appropriation. Again, just highlighting the fact that this is one of the checks and balances that Congress has against the executive branch. Objective 4, explain how the president ensures that executive branch agencies and departments carry out their responsibilities in concert with the goals of the administration. So let's not forget that the bureaucracy is technically part of the executive branch, although the vast majority of the employees within the bureaucracy are not appointed by the president. They do technically work for the president. He is their boss. And so presidents want to shape the bureaucracy. They want the bureaucracy to fall in line with whatever their ideological positions are on different things. And so one of the ways that presidents do that is by appointing at the very tops of these agencies, the positions that they do have the power to fill directly through political appointments. They're going to pick people that are like-minded, that share their policy positions and preferences at the top of these agencies to help shape how the organizations operate. They also are going to use executive orders to specifically direct different elements within the bureaucracy on how they want things interpreted and implemented. And so presidents also are going to want to make sure that the bureaucracy is falling in line with the things that they want them to be doing. So they're going to be responsible for compliance monitoring, making sure that the bureaucracy is actually following the president's orders. And making sure that they're doing that can be a challenge to implementing effectively policies, because sometimes bureaucracy does not fully go along with what the president would like them to be doing. Objective 5, explain the extent to which governmental branches can hold the bureaucracy accountable given the competing interests of Congress, the president, and federal courts. So here we're going to be focusing on, again, checks and balances. One thing I want to point out is that the bureaucracy, even though it is part of the executive branch, is sometimes called the fourth branch of government because it has a lot of power and it has a lot of independence, largely due to the fact that most of the people following the Pendleton Civil Service Act are independently appointed, hired, and fired. So there are a number of formal and informal powers of all three branches to exercise control over the bureaucracy. So I have listed some of them in a convenient table at the bottom here. The president, as we've said, appoints the heads of these agencies as his political appointees. He can use executive orders to direct some of the actions of these agencies within the bureaucracy. He can also do a little bit of limited within a certain boundary of organization, reorganization of different parts of the bureaucracy, and also moving funding around that has been allocated for certain things. We've seen some examples of this with President Trump, who has struggled to get the funding that he would like for the border wall with Mexico. So one of the things that he has done is he has taken funding that's been allocated by Congress to, for example, the Department of Defense, and he has reallocated some of that funding to the limited extent that is permitted by law, and reallocated that for construction of the border wall under the pretense of it being a defense-related activity. Now, there are definitely limits on that. Presidents can't just reallocate funding to, however they would like. It has to fall within the bounds of what's permitted constitutionally and by the laws that are originally passed by Congress. So let's talk about Congress. They can, of course, control the purse strings, power of the purse, which means they can control funding. They have the power to confirm or deny the nominations for the heads of these agencies that are picked by the president. They have oversight power, conducting those hearings, doing research into what the organizations are doing. They can also craft more specific legislation. We talked about how we talked about this in the context of the courts in a previous lecture, that when the courts kind of misinterpret something as the Congress sees it, they can go back and craft more specific legislation. They can do the same thing when it comes to bureaucracy. If they feel the bureaucracy is misinterpreting a law that they had passed, they can go back and be more explicit in how that law words things so that it's very clear. And then finally, the courts, having the power of judicial review, they can rule on the legality or ultimately the constitutionality of different actions pursued by the bureaucracy.